international trade, trade terms are important. A few simple letters determine the rights and obligations of both the buyer and the seller. There are many conventional versions of trade terms. We study the latest one, the 2020 version of International Trade Terms, Incoterm 2020. It's primarily divided into 4 groups with a total of 11 kinds of terms. As shown in the diagram, we will primarily discuss 3 commonly used terms: FOB, CIF, CFR. First, let's look at FOB. FOB, free on board, is a commonly used trade term that refers to the delivery of goods on board a ship at the specified port of shipment. After this term, the name of the loading port should be specified. For example, FOB 大连 indicates that delivery is made on board the ship at Dalian port. Example: Company A from China exports goods to Thailand. Using the FOB trade term, it should be represented as A. FOB Guangzhou, B. FOB Bangkok. The correct option would be A. Under the FOB term, what are the rights and obligations of both the buyer and the seller? Let's take a look at the division of risks, responsibilities, and expenses for both parties in the transaction. The summary of risks, responsibilities, and expense allocation for both parties in the FPB transaction is as follows. Risk. Seller. All risks before the goods are placed on board the ship. Buyer. All risks after the goods are placed on board the ship. Responsibility. Seller. Arranging export customs, clearance procedures, delivery, and presenting documents. Buyer. Chartering a ship, booking space, purchasing insurance, communicating the time and space of unloading at the destination port, completing import customs clearance procedures, receiving the goods, and making payments. Cost. Seller. Export customs clearance and related domestic expenses. Buyer. Insurance fee, ocean freight, and import customs clearance expenses. After learning about the rights and obligations of both the buyer and the seller, let's take a look at this exercise. 1. Which of the following are obligations of the buyer? A. Bear all expenses after the goods are loaded onto the ship. Correct. B. Bear all risks after the goods are loaded onto the ship. Correct. C. Responsible for chartering a ship and booking space. Correct. 2. Which expression of the unit price for the following export goods is correct? A. $250 per barrel. Incorrect. No trade term specified. B. $250 per barrel, CIF, London. Correct. CIF to the destination port. C. $250 per barrel, CIF, Guangzhou. Incorrect. D. $250 per barrel, CFR, Germany. Incorrect. When using FOB terms to allocate expenses for loading, there are several variations of FOB terms. Let's look at the main variations. FOB liner terms. FOB liner terms refers to the practice of handling loading expenses in accordance with liner shipping. This means that the cost of loading is borne by the shipping company or the buyer. Hence, this variation is adopted. The seller is not responsible for the expenses related to loading the goods. FOB under tackle. FOB under tackle means that the seller bears the cost of delivering the goods to the buyer's designated ship's tackle point. However, the expenses related to hosting the goods into the hold, as well as other associated expenses, are borne by the buyer. FOB stowed. FOB stowed means the seller is responsible for loading the goods onto the ship and covering the loading charges, including stowage fees. Stowage fees refer to the expenses incurred in arranging and organizing the goods after they are loaded into the cabin. FOB trimmed. FOB trimmed means that seller is responsible for loading the goods onto the ship and covering the loading charges, including trimming charges. Trimming charges refer to the expenses required to the level the bulk cargo loaded into the cabin. After learning about the rights and obligations of both parties in FOB transactions, the variations of FOB, let's look at the delivery nature of FOB. Seller delivers upon presentation of documents. Buyer pays upon presentation of documents. As long as the seller timely submits the complete and qualified set of documents as stipulated in the contract, even if the goods are damaged or lost during transportation, the buyer still has to fulfill the payment obligation. If the documents submitted by the seller do not meet the requirements, even if the goods arrive at destination intact, the buyer has the right to refuse payment. After learning the key points of knowledge, let's look at the in-class practice. A certain company exports a batch of frozen ducks under FOB terms. After signing the contract, they received a call from the buyer, stating that it was difficult to charter a ship, and entrusted our company to handle this, with the related costs borne by the buyer. In order to facilitate contract performance, we accepted the buyer's request. However, when the shipment deadline arrived, we were unable to find a suitable ship at designated port of shipment, and the buyer did not agree to change the port of shipment. Therefore, when the shipment deadline expired, the goods were still not loaded onto a ship. The buyer, due to the approaching end of the selling season, sent a letter to revoke the contract on the grounds of our failure to deliver the goods on time. Question: how should we handle this situation? Does the buyer have the right to revoke the contract? Analysis: we should insist that the buyer fulfill their obligations, because under FOB terms, chartering a ship and booking cargo space is a buyer's responsibility. We only acted as an agent and do not assume any liability. Therefore, we should insist on the buyer fulfilling their obligations and request them to change the shipment time. When choosing trade terms, if the seller does not want to bear the cost of loading the goods onto the ship, we can consider using FOB liner term or FOB under tackle. These variations of FOB terms clarify the responsibility for loading costs. Both of these variations require the buyer to bear the cost of loading the goods onto the ship. As a foreign trade salesman, we must have the sense of professional mission, be diligent and responsible, prioritize the interests of the company and the country, keep learning, keep up with the times, and always maintain professionalism. How well have you mastered FOB terms through this class? Finally, we have left a post-class exploration exercise for you to think about. Thank you for listening.